All right, awesome. So we're live on Instagram Live here with the founder of ICAV, that is Intercountry Adoptee Voices, here with Lynelle Long. So Lynelle, just feel free to introduce yourself a little bit. Tell us all about ICAV, how it got started.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you so much for having me on your amazing program. Really appreciate the opportunity. I am a Vietnamese adoptee. I was adopted out of Vietnam in the war back in the 70s, before Operation Baby Lift and all of those big programs that most people kind of relate to with Vietnam adoptions. Mine was a private adoption. I came to Australia because my adoptive father actually flew into Vietnam and picked me up out of the war. I had a family here in rural Australia, raised with a family who actually had 4 biological children of their own. I was the only adopted child in their family. They had fostered other children before me, but when I was adopted, I did live in that family as being the only non-biological child during that time. Back in Australia at that time, it was like most countries, quite different to today's landscape of multicultural. The combining of all the races and people from all different countries now. Whereas back then, Australia had just come out of that White Australia policy, so it was a very challenging time to grow up in, because I was often the only non-white child in my community, church, school, anywhere that I went. And therefore I would always, get questions. People always inevitably ask, when I open my mouth and speak with this amazing Australian accent, they're like, where are you from? Like they just can't understand how this Australian voice could come out of an Asian looking body. And I know, in America that's often the situation too for a lot of intercountry adoptees growing up there who are not American in terms of the majority, the white American, but yet have this, amazing American twang. So yeah. So growing up in Australia, I grew up fairly isolated, I didn't even know about adoption. I didn't even really ever think about being adopted. My family didn't speak about being adopted. It's not like at that time that we really understood the importance of raising a child of a different race and acknowledging the differences and maintaining links to culture and heritage. So my childhood was it's kind of like, the scenario of all the things not to do, which thankfully a lot of the generations that have followed have actually benefited from, because we've been speaking for some time now to say, hey, this stuff actually is really important. You can't just adopt a child of a different race into your family and not actually understand that there are these complexities that you have to come to terms with. So when I first started looking for support, when I started to realise actually that I had problems or issues in my life that may be connected to something way back to relating to my adoption, I went looking for a place to connect into where I could kind of, get some resources, talk to people who understood. But at that time, in the early 1990s, there really wasn't anything around. And so I guess, that lack of was really what motivated me to think, I need to do something about this. And because I was working in IBM, I work in IT, I already understood the power of the internet, the power of multimedia. And so I built, ICAV as a platform on the internet. And a lot of people joined in from Australia at the beginning, because I had also contacted a lot of the post-adoption organisations around Australia and said, well, if you have any intercountry adoptees, can I, let them know that, if they want to connect in, I'm more than happy, give them my name and number, and I'll start to build a group. So that was pretty amazing at the beginning. And, at the start, we only had like 20, 30 adoptees who had joined in. The interesting thing was that at that time around the globe, I didn't know then, but I know now, there wasn't a lot that was being provided. Really, the Korean adoptee organisations were the only other really active kind of groups. The Germans had their specific groups. There were some groups, but they were all operating in isolation, and you generally in those days weren't allowed to join unless you were one of them, meaning Koreans could only join Korean groups, Vietnamese could only join Vietnamese groups. So ICAV, I started ICAV with the intention of always making it open to any adoptees of any birth country, because well, first of all, Australia's got quite a small population of inter-country adoptees compared to America. So I knew that the power of numbers would actually benefit us in Australia if we opened it to everybody. Whereas, you know, maybe for, you know, America and countries where you've got hundreds of thousands of adoptees, you know, it made more sense for them to kind of keep isolated. But over the time, I must say, over the 20 years that I've now been doing this and connecting into adoptees from all over the world, I must say there's definitely an advantage to actually connecting across all of those birth countries and understanding that there's a lot of issues that we share in common, regardless of our birth country. And it's so important that we actually connect and find those things in common and use our voices en masse to try and push for the changes that we're wanting. But I've kind of skipped ahead, so I'll come back to when I first started in Australia. Interestingly, because there were very few other groups around online, I had adoptees joining from all over the world. So the Netherlands, America, you know, different countries, UK, Canada. And it was interesting that they did connect in, because I guess they were like me at that time. They were really looking for a place to kind of connect into, a place where they could feel that they could be understood, because, you know, we were all at that stage acting in, you know, we were all feeling isolated. So building this community was really important, particularly back at that time, because nothing existed. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think it's incredible that you talked about the common experiences that a lot of inter-country adoptees had it, regardless if they were Vietnamese at birth, Korean at birth. And it seemed as if all of the inter-country adoptees had to kind of navigate that culture in where they weren't fully either Australian or American because of the way they looked and stuff like that. So I just think that the work that you guys are doing over at ICAV is really awesome. And just to bounce off that as well, what kind of successes and sustainable change have you seen and accomplished with your organization? Because doing a lot of reading, I think that not a lot of people of the general public are aware of the work that you guys do in terms of policy and advocacy.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll start off focusing on that, answering that from an Australian point of view. In Australia, you know, we were very involved right from the early stages when Australia had its first review of intercountry adoption in Australia. So at that time, I sat on that group that advised the government, and it was the first time that adoptees in Australia had been given an invitation to come to the table at government level and actually speak for ourselves. So that was really important, a really important change. And then from that, because we've always had an invitation to the table, in Australia, we've had successes such as our free counselling for all inter-country adoptees in Australia is funded and provided freely by the Australian government to all inter-country adoptees here. I mean, that's just unheard of in any other adoptive country. So in Australia, yeah, we were very successful in getting that free counselling service. We were also given a free search and reunion service, which was only funded for 2 years. Disappointing that funding didn't continue, and we are still fighting to have that reinstated. But, you know, search and reunion is such a massive, massive journey that we have to navigate, where we are vulnerable again, because, you know, in a lot of our birth countries, there can be a lot of unscrupulous people who want to take advantage of us and our situations, our desperation to find our families and to understand our origins. And so, you know, you can have many situations where we can be taken advantage of. People can charge exorbitant fees. They can match you up to people incorrectly. You know, there's so much that can really be taken advantage of from us. And so having a professional organisation actually manage a search and reunion service is hugely important, to make sure that we aren't taken advantage of, and that the contacts and the resources are actually screened and, you know, made sure that they're ethically operating. So that was a huge win as well. Unfortunately, I hope that in the future, you know, in the next 12 months, we might see whether in Australia that we get that back again. Overseas, internationally, some of the successes we have had is that more and more we have been invited to be included at the tables of policy and discussion, which is so important, policy and practice. So, for example, in America last year, the US State Department invited ICAV, and we brought along 10 intercountry adoptee leaders throughout America to come and speak and have their voices and have their faces be visible at the Department of State, which brought together all the other government departments involved in intercountry adoption policy and practice. And that was a huge thing, because in America, what I noticed is that a lot of the adoptee organisations tend to operate in isolation. They don't kind of really connect in with each other and try and leverage off, you know, the huge number and the volume of voices they would have if they all kind of work together. So that was really great for them to meet and connect in for the first time, especially when they've come from all different, you know, country of origins, and to realise that, yeah, there are so many shared experiences. So we also got invited last year to The Hague, which is where all of the governments and countries meet to actually discuss and organise, you know, across the Hague Convention for Intercountry Adoption. So we were invited for the first time as ICAV to attend and represent adoptee interests in the illegal and illicit adoption practices workshop. That's a working group that has been happening for some years. So it was really, really important that we, you know, come to these tables and be able to have a say. Now, I will also point out that, you know, in attending these, it's quite often that we wish that we had more of a say, honestly, to be able to influence. But at the moment, we have to accept that at least they're inviting us to the table, even if our voices aren't really, really listened to from the perspective that we'd love to see. In America too, and around the world, you know, some of the success that you see is just represented in the sheer number of groups that adoptees now lead. As I said and alluded to back in the beginning of what I discussed in terms of the origins of this group, there weren't many other adoptee organisations around. Whereas if you look on the internet today, you know, there are hundreds of adoptee-led groups, all creating their own supports and connecting with each other and leveraging off the knowledge that, you know, we all can share together. And really the whole idea of these groups and the power of them is that we can prevent the reinvention of the wheel, you know. And when an adoptee connects into these groups, they no longer have to figure it all out by themselves from scratch. They can benefit from the 20, 30 years of connecting that adoptees have done. They can be given straight away good resources, great contacts if they're wanting to search in their countries or return to their, you know, to their roots. And they don't have to spend, you know, the five years that I probably spent, you know, just trying to figure it all out and find, you know, who are the reputable people to talk to. So things like that. There's also the fact that around the world now, our voices are speaking out in such volume that we are challenging the normal mantra of adoption. The usual adoption mantra says, you know, adopt a child and everything will be wonderful and you're giving a child a home. Well, what we are really doing is giving more of a nuanced and complex view of what that mantra really means in lived experience. So we can we can help adoptee families and adoptees understand better that this is not just a rosy, glossy picture. This actually is really involving tough, complex issues that we have to navigate and we have to wrap our heads around and come to terms with. And that can be a process that can take many years. So it's awesome to see that so many adoptees are collecting en masse and joining in on platforms like ICAV to really challenge the everyday mantra on adoption and to make it more realistic and to make it more complex and nuanced. The other thing that's amazing to see, and this is what I really am excited about in terms of the move towards success for pushing for the rights of adoptees, is that you see a lot of adoptees worldwide now actually starting to take legal action, which is just fantastic, because sadly it's probably the only way that governments are ever really going to listen to our voices and hear and learn about the mistakes made in the historical adoptions. So, for example, there is some amazing adoptees who have led the way in all of this stuff. So you have people like Patrick Nordoven in the Netherlands. He won and fought for his right to identity, his right to his original papers, and his right to know who he was when he had actually been a baby who had been falsified at birth, and made it look like he had been adopted. So he did amazing in winning that case, and subsequently the Dutch government has actually proceeded to conduct an investigation now into 5 different countries of birth that we represent. So the Brazil, Indonesia, Sri Lanka. There's a couple of others that escape me right now, but that's an amazing success. You'll also see right now, you've got the case of Delani. She's a Sri Lankan adoptee in the Netherlands. She is actually suing the Dutch government and the Dutch organisation who facilitated her adoption. Adoptees pushing for their rights who have had an illegal and really dodgy adoption. It's so long overdue, because we have so many of them around the world who fit under that umbrella of illicit adoptions. And sadly, I've taken groups of adoptees to our Australian government to ask for services and support for those adoptees who lived that experience of, finding out that they were trafficked. And most governments just refuse to do anything about it. They turn a blind eye. So the Dutch government is the first to actually conduct an investigation because of the voice of an adoptee. And this is really exciting stuff to see happening around the world. In Korea, you have Adam Krapsa, who is actually, he started to take action against the Holt adoption agency for his adoption, which ended up terribly in deportation back to Korea. And this is a huge issue that, not many people really understand, is that in inter-country adoption, we don't have a right to stay in our country if we've been adopted to America, because citizenship for a lot of adoptees prior to a certain era, a certain date, are still not guaranteed citizenship, and so they are at risk of being deported if they did any type of minor crime or major crime. Regardless of the crime, they shouldn't be deported, because they have been raised as a citizen. They should have been raised as a citizen, and adoption as its premise usually talks about permanence. So you've got to wonder, how can countries agree to adopt children but then have them sent back when it suits them? That's not permanence, and that is not in the interest of the child. So his case is quite outstanding. Then you've got in New Zealand, one closer to my home. There's Bev Ruetti. She was a Maori adoptee, displaced out of her race, out of her culture. And there is a treaty in New Zealand that says that shouldn't have happened. So she is, in the last few years, she's been starting to build together a case of which other Maori adoptees are joining in to push for the New Zealand government to, accept the injustice that has happened there. And then in the US, you've got an adoptee, Cara Boss. She's currently in South Korea filing for paternity rights, the right to have her potential hopeful birth parents, agree to a paternity test with DNA to prove whether or not they are indeed her family. And this right of adoptees to actually understand who are our mother and father. It's a fundamental right that everybody else who's not adopted takes for granted. You know who your mum and dad are, you know who you look like. But for us, the fundamental issue that's wrong with adoption in all plenary adoptions is that we have that right to know who we are stripped away from us. Our name gets changed. We get birth certificates that are amended. We get birth certificates that say our adoptive parents are our as if born to parents. And that is an issue that not many people really really understand about adoption. And certainly when adoption agencies promote adoption and tell birth mothers that, your child will be placed into this amazing family, they certainly don't help the mothers to understand that, do you understand that your child is going to be legally relinquished from you forever, and we're going to wipe out your name as that child's mother and replace it with somebody else? They don't tell you the full story. The other amazing thing is that it's not just adoptees that are starting to speak out and take action. In the US, you have Adam and Jessica Davis, who returned their Ugandan child when they found out that she indeed wasn't a true orphan and that she actually had a mother who loved her and wanted her. Her mother, like many mothers and fathers in our birth countries, often think of our white Western countries as the heaven, where we will have everything that is needed in terms of our basic rights, our basic needs: shelter, food, clothing, education, and all the material goods. And so they think, a lot of these countries don't even understand what adoption is in legal terms. They just think of it more alike as a sponsorship or some form of, I'm going to take your child and educate her and bring her back. Well, they don't realize that adoption doesn't mean you get them back. You actually are relinquishing your right to your child. So Jessica and Adam have been absolutely, outstanding in terms of, in the 20 years I've been dealing with adoption and connecting to the community. I have rarely heard of an adoptive parent who will actually help reunite the child with the family and support them to be together into the future. That's so rare, and to be upheld as our model for what we should be aiming for in this space, because there is just so much wrong that is done when we are separated, but yet we actually have families who do want us but just don't understand what they're really signing up for. And then, of course, there's another amazing case that's happened in the last couple of years as well, and that is the Guatemalan father, Gustavo Tobar, and he won his right back to his children who were sent to America from Guatemala without the right, without getting permission really from the mother and father in Guatemala. So it took them many years, but they won that case as well, and that's to me would be the first major case I've heard of a first family winning back the rights to their child. And when you just look at that scenario in itself, and if I try and help our audience understand, a lot of these families are suffering trauma, generational trauma, poverty, unstable governments. So many of us come from ethnic minority backgrounds, so they're experiencing a lot of the discrimination that goes with that. Like, for them as families to be able to stand up in their country and say, you need to help me fight for my right back to my child, it just doesn't happen. In comparison, you'll probably remember cases like Madeleine McCann, right? The white child who gets stolen or lost somehow from the parents. Look at the media publicity that they garnered around the world. Do you think that a Guatemalan poor couple is ever going to be able to get that type of resources, connections, coverage to help them reunite with their child. It just doesn't happen because too often a lot of the issues in intercountry adoption are about privilege, about those who have more resource-wise, wealth-wise, education-wise, race-wise. It's such an imbalance in power and people. And these are the real issues that we talk about as intercountry adoptees, because being raised in these white wealthy countries and having the mentality of that, we literally do sit in that in-between space of understanding how it is for our first families, but also understanding how it is for our adoptive families. And so we really are the meat in between the sandwich, where we have to understand both sides. And it's a really difficult position to juggle, especially when we come at it from our very adoptive-centric lens that filters everything, and it takes us a good part of our adoption journey to really get to a place where we can put on our birth country lens and start to have some understanding of intercountry adoption from that lens as well. And that just adds so many layers to what has happened to us and what we've experienced and what we stand up for to speak about. So yeah, there was a lot in that. That was a big answer to your question of what successes have we had and what sustainable changes would we continue to to see further into the future. But what I do hope to see more of in the future is that there will be more recognition from our governments who are facilitating and agreeing to intercountry adoption, and that they actually put more funding and resources into those resources that are so needed for pre and post adoption, particularly post, because a lot of governments, they really do wash their hands of adoption once the child is transacted to a new family, and they let go of all responsibility, and they refuse to see it as a lifelong journey where really they should have responsibility for us, even if they've handed us to another country, because they placed us there to begin with. And they said, in effect, we aren't going to look after this child ourselves. We're going to hand it over to somebody else. So from that point of view, we believe there's that moral and ethical responsibility to look after us from a longitudinal perspective and make sure that if you're going to conduct that type of business, well, do it with some ethics and make sure that the children are being followed up on, make sure you understand what you're doing, and make sure you're providing all the resources to enhance the option for a better outcome. Because, too many of us struggle, too many of us deal with, mental health struggles, identity struggles. We constantly grow up feeling like we just don't know where we belong, fitting into a family that doesn't look like us. There's just so many complex issues that we have to actually deal with and navigate.
Thank you for that. I think that, while you may have said, it's a long-winded answer, I think it just speaks to the successes and sustainable change that ICAV has been able to create. I think for me, a person who's worked a little bit in human development and stuff like that, for you to talk about all these people and all these organizations that have stemmed out of the movement of ICAV, in Korea, Uganda, all these, really across the globe, organizations that have started talking about more sustainable change and how we can better support inter-country adoptees and, their rights, like you were saying, and especially empowering the citizens who may have their children be adopted by, developed nations as well. I think what you were talking about is sometimes with the power dynamic, they think that, like we send our child off and they'll come back after receiving an education, not really being aware of what adoption means. And for you to, and your organization, as well as affiliates, to really talk about, the benefits and the negatives of adoption, as well as, what exactly it means and just all the legal ramifications is so important. And so, while it's incredible.
I do just want to correct something, because I don't want to give the misperception that ICAV has created all this. Let me tell you what ICAV is and what it isn't. Okay, ICAV is a platform. It's a platform that I've built online that brings together adoptee leaders and outspoken people in the adoption community, and we bring them together on social media. Now, I I'm not the one creating all this change. All I'm doing is elevating their voices, bringing them together, encouraging that type of activity, and creating the opportunity for adoptee fellows to share what each other is doing, which what it ends up creating is like momentum and encourage. It creates a space where we are encouraged to continue to build off that momentum and to share with each other what we do, because it's so important that we recognize that there is growing momentum, and that it is individual people all in their own way and space doing what they do, but there is power to bringing it together as a big picture and to helping the world realize that in this big picture you have all these individual people and organizations doing this amazing, incredible work. So all ICAV is a platform that brings that together as a snapshot and elevates that to say, look, this is what is happening, and you can no longer ignore or deny our voices, because it's so important that you listen to what we're saying. So we encourage advocacy at national and international level. We elevate the voices of those who live it. That's adoptees, that's first families, that's adoptive families. They are the three in the triad who must be listened to for all intercountry adoption policy practice, and to really learn from how we experiencing it. Because policy and things like the Hague Convention, they're all airy-fairy, waffly, fluffy, feel good, oh, this would be awesome to have. But how it actually gets done in practice and how it actually affects us in reality is a completely different thing, and really needs to be brought into together so that you get a more complete picture of what is really going on. So hopefully that helps clarify that it is not me, ICAV, doing all these individual things. I'm just simply creating a space in which we can make it visible and encourage each other, which, there wasn't a space like this before in one place where we as adoptee leaders could really connect into each other and share information and knowledge and be encouraged by fellow adoptees who believed in the same mission and ideas. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. My apologies for not really understanding that. But in terms of just ICAV overall, it seems like it's been able to empower a lot of these people to kind of
Yeah.
go about their change, which is incredible as well. And what
Yeah,
if
because it
I,
reduces the feeling of isolation. We're no longer operating in isolation, which is how we all were at the beginning. This
right,
shows the momentum and brings us together as a around the world.
absolutely. And I think that sense of solidarity is just so incredibly important. And again, it seems like something that, pun intended, just is really transcending borders in so many different ways. And
Yes.
for us, one of the kind of final takeaways that we want to ask for you is, how can we be better, just a common person, not in terms of, like policy and stuff like that, like very high government level affairs, but just a common person? How can we be better advocates for intercountry adoptees? What can we do to really talk about the issues, or make the lives of intercountry adoptees a little bit easier?
Yeah. Well, the most important way that you can help is doing what you are doing now, which is to help elevate our voices. So for those who know an adoptee, whenever they are brave enough to share something on social media or in person, help to elevate that voice and that person, and reconfirm that it is so important we hear what they've got to say, because it is lived experience, which is the most important way to learn from, the things that are going wrong, the things that are going right about intercountry adoption. So it's so important. And listen to the concerns that we have, and listen especially to, a lot of people switch off because they straight away, if we talk about complexities, they straight away switch off and say, oh, you're just angry adoptees, bitter, twisted, we're not going to listen to you. Well, there is validity to hearing our historical concerns about how adoptions were done and how adoptions are still being done. There is real validity to the fact that, our birth documents are forged and falsified, and we aren't given the truth. that we can't go to our adoption agencies or our orphanages and just ask, can I have all my adoption paperwork so I know who I am? We still get told, no, you cannot have that, because they say they're protecting the rights of the birth family. You know, and somehow there's got to be a better way to balance the needs of, you know, the adoptees in our first families, where it can be done more respectfully, and where adoptees' rights and birth families can you know, be respected. There are other ways too that you know, help to share. A lot of the organisations who are doing a lot of this amazing work, share about the work that they're doing, support them. You know, for example, there is a mass movement in America led by two major adoptee organisations, Adoptees for Justice and Adoptee Rights Campaign, who are both pushing for legislation to change in America so that adoptees will be given citizenship and so they won't be deported. Like, people need to get behind these movements and help push to their senators, to their representatives, and help them understand that this is wrong, what's happened to intercountry adoptees who aren't given citizenship, you know. And as if more people got on board and helped support these causes, you know, that is what can be done to help advocate for us. We have a huge overrepresentation of adoptees struggling with mental health issues, you know, and in America right now, you've got a lot that's going out for mental health awareness. There's a lot of things that adoptees are talking about in terms of suicide attempts, in terms of abuse in adoptive families, in terms of the racism that we are seeing on an increase because of coronavirus and the way that people are targeting Asians. We are also part of that group who's getting targeted, and it's what it does for us is add on to the many layers of trauma that we've already got from being, you know, relinquished from our mothers for whatever reason. And so there is such a compounding of traumatic issues for us, and a lot of people just don't understand that. But you know, you try and get on board and hear about what we're talking about and listen, and help to elevate the voices that are out there that are brave enough and courageous enough to speak out. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think that kind of segues perfectly because, you know, this interview is kind of being done for Mental Health Week that we're doing over here at I Am. And just really listening to your story and just the way that your organization has really been able to empower, and like you're saying, the issue of what intercountry adoptees kind of face, you know, on a daily basis sometimes gets escalated in times of crisis like this. So I think that everything you have been doing is incredible. I suggest that everyone check out ICAV. I'll link the website in our Instagram, as well as, if possible, sending over some of the links of the people that you had mentioned earlier. I would think it would be incredible to just kind of get these organizations the recognition that they deserve for all the work that they have been doing. So with that, thank you so much, Lynelle, for your time and for all the work that you've been doing.
Thank you for having me. It's been awesome to talk to you, Kenny. Take care.
Take care. Have a good one.
Yep. Bye.